sides. He tilted his head, his tone gentler than he intended. May I ask why? Victoria turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched below them like a glowing circuit board, beautiful yet cold. Because tomorrow they'll ask about my personal life, she whispered, and I can't give them the truth. The truth is, I go home to an empty penthouse, eat takeout, and bury myself in quarterly reports. Her confession hung in the air, fragile and aching. Daniel felt it settle in his chest, the way grief recognizes grief. He knew the echo of empty rooms, dinners eaten in silence, the weight of absence pressing against walls. For him, it was the loss of a wife, a career, a future. For her, it was a life consumed by power and isolation. Different roads, same emptiness. He set the mop aside, straightened slowly, and after a long silence, he nodded. All right, he said, 7 minutes. And for the first time in years, Victoria Hale allowed herself to breathe. Daniel lay awake long after he'd left Horizon Tower that night. The hum of the city outside his small apartment window faded into the background as he replayed Victoria Hale's words. Pretend you love me. Just for 7 minutes. It should have sounded laughable, ridiculous even, but it didn't. Her voice had carried something raw, something too fragile to be ignored. He pushed himself up from the couch, rubbing his hands over his face. His eyes wandered to the small bedroom down the hall, where a soft glow spilled out beneath the door. Mia was asleep, her steady breathing a comfort that never failed him. 7 years old, all curls and questions, she was the only anchor left in a life that had once been so different. Daniel walked quietly to her doorway, leaning against the frame as he watched her sleep. She clutched a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest, its seams stretched thin from years of love. Her drawings, castles, stars, and rocket ships were taped unevenly across the walls, bright colors fighting against the drab paint of the apartment. He remembered the man he used to be, a young aerospace engineer, standing beside prototypes of engines that carried his name on the schematics. He had built things that soared, that cut through clouds, that promised futures. But all it had taken was one decision to speak up about safety violations, one lawsuit that dragged his name through the mud, and everything collapsed like a tower of cards. The company had stripped him of his career. The legal fees drained every cent of their savings. And then came the cruelest blow, the night his wife never came home, the accident that left Mia motherless and him broken. For 3 years, he had traded blueprints for mop handles, boardrooms for hallways where no one looked him in the eye. He kept his head down, told himself dignity could be found in doing any job well, even this one. But dignity didn't buy Mia new shoes when hers wore thin. Dignity didn't pay for better schools or the piano lessons she begged for. Money mattered, and Victoria Hale's offer, whatever it was, carried the weight of change. Yet, it wasn't just the promise of payment that kept gnawing at him. It was her eyes. He had seen 1,000 polished faces pass through Horizon Tower, all clipped voices and expensive perfumes, but hers that night had cracked in a single moment. The woman known for being untouchable had looked unbearably human. She had reminded him of himself, staring at an empty chair across the dinner table, filling silence with numbers and reports. Loneliness wore many disguises, but Daniel had learned to recognize it in others as surely as he recognized it in himself. He moved into the living room, sat heavily at the table littered with Mia's crayons and half-finished homework sheets. One of her drawings lay on top, a house with smoke curling from the chimney, stick figures holding hands in front, one tall, one small, and one with long hair. He traced it with his finger, his throat tightening. Maybe Mia had always been wiser than him. Maybe she already knew what he hadn't been brave enough to admit, that they needed more than survival. They needed connection. Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. Tomorrow night, he would step into a suit that didn't belong to him, into a world that had forgotten men like him existed. And for 7 minutes, he would hold the hand of a woman who ruled that world, yet longed for something real. He didn't know what would come after. He only knew that for the first time in years, he was about to say yes, not just for the money, but because sometimes a stranger's desperation mirrors your own. He glanced once more toward Mia's door, then whispered into the quiet apartment, "All right, Victoria Hale, 7 minutes it is." The mirror hardly recognized him, and neither did he. The midnight blue suit fit like it had been cut for his frame alone, its subtle sheen catching the low light of the apartment. Daniel adjusted the tie with unsteady fingers. His calloused hands, more familiar with grease and mop water, looked strangely at home against the crisp fabric. For a moment, he felt like an actor about to step onto a stage with no script. Only this time, the audience was filled with people who measured worth in power and profit, not in the quiet resilience of a janitor. At the base of Horizon Tower, security did a double take before checking his name on the guest list. It still felt surreal. Then the elevator doors opened and there she was, Victoria Hale. Gone was the severe suit of the boardroom. In its place, a dress the color of emeralds, shimmering softly under the lights. The hue pulled green flecks from her hazel eyes, and though her posture remained impeccable, Daniel sensed the tension beneath it, like a violin string pulled too tight. She gave him a small smile, one that faltered at the edges. "You clean up nice," she murmured. The elevator rose silently, carrying them toward the penthouse level, where the gala unfolded. Daniel tugged at his cuff, his nerves betraying him. "What's our story?" he asked. Victoria didn't miss a beat. "We met at a coffee shop," she said smoothly. "You were reading a book about engineering, and I asked about it. We've been seeing each other for 2 months. Her voice softened, almost wistful, as though she wanted to believe it herself. "And if they ask about the future?" Daniel pressed. She hesitated, then looked straight ahead. "Tell them we're taking it one day at a time." The doors opened to a room drenched in crystal light and murmured wealth. Chandeliers scattered rainbows across marble floors. Men in tailored suits and women draped in diamonds moved like currents in a glittering sea. Daniel inhaled slowly, felt Victoria's hand slip into his, warm and trembling. 7 minutes, he reminded her under his breath. She nodded, though something flickered in her eyes, a fleeting shadow of disappointment. They entered the crowd together, and at first, he thought of it as nothing more than an elaborate performance. He shook hands, smiled politely, followed Victoria's lead. But then something shifted. The conversations about innovation and markets tugged at the dormant engineer in him, and his responses were more than polite filler. They were genuine. Victoria laughed at something he said, not the rehearsed laugh she wore for investors, but one that escaped from somewhere real. The sound startled them both. Time stretched. 7 minutes slipped into 15, then 30. Daniel found himself moving through the crowd as though he belonged, though deep down he knew he didn't. What unnerved him more was the way Victoria kept looking at him when she thought no one else noticed. The softness in her gaze, the pride in her voice when she introduced him, the way her hand lingered on his arm like it wasn't part of a contract, but something she wanted. Then came the moment that undid him. An elderly board member asked Victoria what made her so certain about this man by her side. Victoria turned, her eyes searching Daniel's face with quiet intensity, and with a tenderness that made his breath catch, she answered simply, "He sees me." Those 3 words hung in the air, heavier than crystal chandeliers, truer than any deal sealed in that room. Daniel felt the weight of them lodge in his chest, because in that moment, he understood this wasn't acting anymore. Pretending to love Victoria Hale had begun to feel dangerously close to the most honest thing he'd done in years. The air on the balcony was cooler, thinner somehow, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Daniel stepped out first, grateful for the quiet after the dizzying whirl of chandeliers and champagne glasses. He braced his hands on the stone railing, staring at the sweep of Chicago skyline glittering below. For a moment, it felt like standing between 2 worlds, the one that sparkled beneath him and the one he carried inside, lined with worn shoes by the door and bedtime stories whispered to a child who still believed in magic. The door clicked open behind him, and then she was there. Victoria Hale, emerald gown brushing against the tile, heels soft against the floor. She didn't carry herself like the CEO who commanded rooms with a glance. Out here, in the shadow of the city lights, she looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of her empire had been left inside. She leaned on the railing a few feet away, exhaling a breath she seemed to have held all night. "Thank you," she said quietly. He turned his head, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. "For what?" "For making me feel normal," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the maze of lights below. For a little while in there, I wasn't the woman every headline expects me to be. I wasn't the Hale Empire or quarterly reports or succession plans. I was just someone standing beside another person, laughing like it mattered. Her words carried a tremor, fragile yet unflinchingly honest. Daniel studied her profile, the way her hair caught the faint shimmer of the city glow, the way her shoulders eased for the first time since he'd met her. Something inside him shifted. This wasn't the same woman he'd agreed to help for 7 minutes. This wasn't the untouchable figure on magazine covers. This was a woman confessing loneliness. And in her confession, he recognized his own. He wanted to tell her he understood, that he too went home to rooms that echoed with silence that pressed against his chest. He wanted to tell her about Mia's drawings taped to cracked walls, how those little splashes of color were the only proof that love still lived under his roof. Instead, he found himself saying softly, "You're welcome." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the cold kind. It was the silence that hums with things unspoken, with truths hovering just beyond reach. Daniel felt her hand graze the railing closer to his, not quite touching, but near enough to make his pulse quicken. He thought about the deal they'd made, 7 minutes of pretending. But out here on this balcony, there was no script, no audience, only a woman trembling with the relief of being seen, and a man realizing he no longer knew where pretending ended and truth began. Victoria finally turned, her hazel eyes luminous, threaded with something that looked almost like fear. "This is crazy," she whispered, almost to herself. Daniel's voice was steady when he answered, "Maybe, but it feels real." Her lips parted as though to argue, but nothing came. The city spread out behind them like a living witness, and the space between them closed without either of them moving. For the first time that night, Daniel wasn't counting minutes, and for the first time in years, Victoria wasn't performing. She was simply a woman standing in the cool night air, allowing herself to be human. And somewhere deep inside, Daniel knew whatever line they had drawn had already blurred beyond recognition. The morning after the gala, Daniel slipped back into his uniform, trading the tailored suit for gray coveralls that smelled faintly of bleach and dust. Horizon Tower looked the same as it always did, polished marble and glass that reflected perfection. But something inside him had shifted. He pushed his cart down the executive hall, forcing himself to ignore the ache that came with memory, the warmth of her hand, the tremor in her laugh, the way her eyes had softened when the crowd wasn't watching. At his locker, he found an envelope resting neatly on the shelf, his name written in precise, elegant handwriting. Inside was payment, more than generous, more than he had expected, and a single note, "Thank you." 2 words that should have satisfied him, but instead left a hollow sting. Money meant new shoes for Mia, maybe even a weekend where the bills didn't weigh so heavy. But the envelope also drew a line, as if what had passed between them could be neatly filed under transaction. He slipped it back into his locker, the metallic clang echoing louder than it should. Days passed. He kept his head down, mopping the endless corridors, pretending that night had been nothing but an unusual job. Yet every time the elevator chimed, he found himself listening for the click of her heels. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, when the lobby was quieter than usual. He looked up, and there she was, Victoria Hale, not in armor of silk and diamonds, but in jeans and a soft sweater. She looked almost unrecognizable, as though she'd borrowed someone else's life for the day. "I came to return the suit," she said, holding a garment bag, but her eyes lingered on his face, searching, questioning. Daniel reached for the bag, his voice even. "You could have sent it with security." She gave a small shrug, awkward in its honesty. "I wanted to make sure it fit properly for next time." The words hung between them, charged with possibility. Before he could respond, a familiar voice piped up from a corner table. "Daddy?" Mia called, waving a crayon-stained hand. She sat with her homework spread out across the marble, her legs swinging restlessly under the chair. Daniel had arranged with security to let her wait there after school until his shift ended. Her dark eyes widened when she saw Victoria, curiosity lighting her expression. "This is Miss Hale," Daniel introduced carefully, pride slipping into his tone. "She works upstairs." Mia smiled shyly, then pushed a sheet of paper toward them. A drawing, bold lines and bright colors filled with towers and windows. "It's a castle," she explained. But it's lonely because only one person lives in it. Victoria knelt beside her, the emerald polish gone, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. Maybe, she said gently, the person in the castle just needs to learn how to open the door. Mia considered this with the seriousness only a child could muster. Then, with a flourish, she picked up a purple crayon and drew a wide, glowing doorway at the base of the castle. There, she announced proudly, now people can come visit. Her eyes darted between her father and Victoria with innocent wisdom. Daddy, she said matter-of-factly, you should invite Miss Hale to dinner. She looks like she doesn't get invited to things very much. Daniel froze, caught between the world he had built and the one he'd been too afraid to imagine. Victoria's soft laugh broke the silence, not polished, not practiced, but real. And for the first time in days, Daniel felt something dangerous stir inside him again. Hope. Victoria hesitated at the base of the narrow stairwell, garment bag still in her hand, as though one more step might cross a line she couldn't return from. The building was nothing like Horizon Tower. Here the walls were lined with faded paint, and the faint aroma of someone's cooking drifted through the halls. Yet when Daniel opened the door and Mia's laughter spilled out, something inside her softened. The apartment was small, but it radiated warmth. Photographs of Mia lined the shelves, gap-toothed smiles, birthday candles. School art projects were clipped to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like stars. The kitchen was alive with motion, pots simmering, plates set carefully by Mia herself. We're having spaghetti, Daniel said, slipping an apron over his shoulders. He looked both awkward and at ease, like a man stepping into a part of himself that had always been there. And fair warning, he added with a grin, Mia made dessert. She calls them surprise cookies. Dinner was chaotic in the most endearing way. Mia chattered about school, her hands painting pictures in the air, while Daniel shared dry little stories about odd things he found during late-night cleaning shifts. Victoria listened, laughed, even reached for seconds of spaghetti that tasted far better than she expected. The secret ingredient, Daniel admitted sheepishly, was cinnamon against all logic. It worked. The cookies, an improbable mix of marshmallows, chocolate chips, and crumbled crackers, were messy but delightful. For the first time in years, Victoria felt herself relaxing without effort. No cameras, no shareholders, no need to perform, just a father, his daughter, and a table that felt fuller than her entire penthouse ever had. When Mia yawned over her glass of milk, Daniel ruffled her hair gently and sent her off to bed. Brush your teeth, he called, his voice softened with affection. Soon, the apartment grew quiet, save for the hum of the old refrigerator. Victoria helped gather plates, her manicured hands drying dishes older than she was. She looked around at the chipped mug Daniel refused to throw away, the grocery list scrawled in 2 different handwritings, the silly flower Mia had tucked into a jar on the counter.